Good evening, Bearcats. This is 4.4, day 2, and this is trig functions of any angle, and we're just continuing this section. Actually, I'm just going to work a few examples for you this evening. I don't have a lot for you to do. I do want to make sure that when you come in tomorrow that you pay attention to what's on the board. I'll have several problems on the board, and I want you to get out your notes so that I can see them, and then and don't wait. Just go ahead and get started with the things on the board. The notes that you take tonight will help you with the particular problems that are on the board. Okay, the first section, the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to evaluate sine, cosine, and tangent of an angle without using a calculator, and we've done this before. So we're going to look at problem. Actually, these are some of the problems you're supposed to work in class, so these will be a few less you have to do. This is problem 45, and this is actually on page 319. So you know. Problem 45 gives us an angle of 225 degrees, and we're asked to find the sine, cosine, and tangent. So we're looking for sine, cosine, and tan theta. All right, 225. Let's go ahead and draw our grid. And 225 degrees. Well, this is 180, so 225 has to be in the third quadrant because 270 is down here. So we'll draw this, and remember we always draw up to the x-axis, and this will be our theta, and this will be our reference angle. So I'm going to put one of those little dashes on there so we know it's our reference angle. Because the full angle is 225. If you go all the way around, it would be 225, but we want this reference. So from 180 to 225, we're talking about what? Hopefully you know that we're talking about 45 degrees. That's our reference angle. So the first thing we're going to do is think of sine at 45 degrees. That's the square root of 2 over 2. Cosine at 45 degrees is square root of 2 over 2. Tan at 45 degrees is 1. But push pause. Stop for just a second and think before you move on that you have to realize that you are in the third quadrant, not the first quadrant. Reference angles in the first quadrant are always positive, not true in the other quadrants. So we are in all surfers to California land here, and in the third quadrant, tangent and cotangent are positive, so therefore our sine and our cosine value would be negative. And if you don't put the negative, then it would not be correct. All right, you'll be able to go ahead and do 47 and 49 from that. I'll probably have those up on the board for you tomorrow. Let's take a look at 51. And it's the same thing except it's in radian measure. So 51 gives us 4 pi over 3. Again, we're going to want sine, theta, cosine, theta, and tan theta. All right, let's take a look. 4 pi over 3. Well, reference-wise, we know this is 3 pi over 3. So 4 pi over 3 would be in the fourth quadrant, our third quadrant, sorry, and we're going to draw down, and this would be our reference angle. Well, thirds, we have to think of thirds, our denominator. Think about thirds as a denominator. Thirds had to do with 60 degrees. So if we are... we had 60, 60, and 60. That would be our 3/3, and we have 60 more. So this is 60 degrees, or our reference is pi over 3. All right, so if you can imagine your chart, I'm going to write my chart out again. I'm going to ask you again, if you have not memorized the chart, please write your chart 3 times again. If you think you believe you've memorized it, then what I need you to do at the go back to the very beginning of your notes that you're taking right now and write it 1 time and circle it and write "Go Bearcats" by it. And you can even draw me a bear paw if you would like. That way when I'm looking at notes tomorrow, I make sure that you've written your chart out. Okay, so remember our chart has to do with our our 60, 45, and 30 degree angles. That's our theta. That would be pi over 3, pi over 4, and pi over 6. And it has to do with our cosine, our sine, and our tan values. All right, so remember at 30 degrees we have the square root of 3 over 2, sine is 1/2, tan is the square root of 3 over 3. Jumping up to 60, these are reciprocals, so they're 1/2, and then the square root of 3 over 2, and then we take the reciprocal of this and rationalize it, we get the square root of 3. 45 is an easy one, the square root of 2 over 2, the square root of 2 over 2, and 1. And you should be able to do it that quickly if you're practicing. If you're not practicing, you need to practice some more. All right, so we are in the third quadrant. We're talking about thirds, so that's our reference angle. And in the third quadrant, sine is the square root of 3 over 2. Cosine is 1/2, and tangent is the square root of 3. But push pause. All right, all surfers to California, make sure you're really careful about what's positive and negative. Tan and cotan are positive, so that would mean our cosine and our sine are negative, and then you would have the correct answer. That will help you with 55 and 57. All right, and those will be up on the board tomorrow, so you can get busy on them right away. Let's next take a look at problem 60, which will help you with 59. So this is problem 60. I like these problems a lot. Let's see, they give us some information. They tell us that cotan, theta, is equivalent to -3. They tell us that we're in quadrant 2, and we want to know the sine value. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw my grid. And I know I'm in quadrant 2, so I'm going to draw a quadrant 2 triangle. And I know my theta is right here. Cotan is -3, and I'm just going to put it over 1. Cotan, alright, well we know tan is opposite over adjacent, therefore cotan would have to be adjacent over opposite. So we're kind of combining what we know with our angles and also with our SOHCAHTOA. Alright, so adjacent would be -3, and opposite would be 1. And then we would find the missing side, which would be our hypotenuse. So we'd have 3 squared, which is 9, 1 squared is 1, 9 and 1 is 10, the square root of 10, which can't be simplified any further. So we would leave it as the square root of 10. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So opposite would be 1, and hypotenuse would be the square root of 10. Sine in the second quadrant, all surfers, is positive, so we don't have to worry about that. But we do need to rationalize our denominator, square root of 10, square root of 10, and now we have the square root of 10 over 10, and that would be our final answer. Now, I'm going through this rather quickly, so if you need to go back and pause and think about what we're doing, please do. But this should start to feel somewhat comfortable for you. If you're not feeling comfortable right now, then that means you've not practiced enough and you need to go back and work a few more problems or get some help from your group or get some help from me before school. All right, let's take a look at 62, which will help you with 61 and 63. 62 is a cosecant, some information about cosecant theta. And they tell us that cosecant is -2. This time they tell us we're in quadrant 4, and we want to know cotan. Alright, well we've got a lot of things going on. Cosecant would be hypotenuse over adjacent, opposite, over opposite. Cotan would be adjacent over opposite. Alright, well we know the opposite part, so this is -2 over 1. So we're going to draw our grid. We were told we were in quadrant 4, so draw a fourth quadrant right triangle. Here's our theta, our reference angle. Alright, so they tell us that cosecant is -2 over 1, which is hypotenuse over opposite. Remember, our hypotenuse could really never be negative, so this is really just a -2 over 1 fraction. So the 1 would have to be the negative. So hypotenuse is always positive, it would be 2. And opposite would be 1, in this case -1, which makes sense in the fourth quadrant anyway. Then we would need to find our missing side. Well, since this is already the hypotenuse, we would subtract our leg. So we'd have 2 squared is 4, 1 squared is 1, 4 minus 1 is 3, and we would take the square root and get the square root of 3. So now we have our triangle filled out, and we want cotan. Cotan is adjacent to the reference angle, which would be the square root of 3 over -1. So I'm going to say -1, which just really ends up being a negative square root of 3. All right, go Bearcats. All right, one more problem, and that's it for tonight. Make sure that you do what I ask you about your little chart and the Go Bearcats and your notes, and also be ready to work as soon as you get to class tomorrow so we can do a little bit of calculator work. Somebody was supposed to remind everybody to pick up a calculator when you come in tomorrow. We're going to use it for just a small part of our assignment tomorrow, but not the stuff that's written on the board. So please don't use it until I instruct you to do so, so that you're practicing like you're going to have on your test. All right, last I'm going to work problem 64. 64 is a secant. They give you information about secant theta. They tell you that secant is -9/4. And we really don't know if it's the 9 or the 4. We're going to figure that out in a minute. They tell you we're in quadrant 3, and we want to know tan theta. All right, so first building my axis. Quadrant 3, I'm drawing a third quadrant right triangle. Now I'm going to go back. Secant is friends with cosine. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so secant would have to be hypotenuse over adjacent. We know the hypotenuse cannot be negative, so the hypotenuse would be a positive 9, and the adjacent side would be your negative 4. I'm going to pause just a second to make sure you're understanding that part. That can be a little tricky, and I did that kind of quick. All right, just before we keep going, let's go ahead and say tan. Tan is going to be opposite over adjacent, so that's going to help us. And we know adjacent is already negative 4, so that's going to be helpful. Okay, this is the hypotenuse. 9 squared is 81. 4 squared is 16, so we have 81 minus 16, and then we're going to end up taking the square root of that value. If I just did that too fast, let's just put it to, we're missing this y value right here. So if we have negative 4 squared plus y squared equals 9 squared. So what we just did was 16 plus y squared equaled 81 squared. Oh, not squared, 81. And so now we have y squared equals 81 minus 16, and we have y equals the square root of 81 minus 16. All right, and 81 minus 16, I believe, is 65. Oops. And 65 is already simplified, because if you divide prime numbers, if you divide 65 by 5, you would get 13. 5 and 13 are both prime, so the square root of 65 is just going to be what it is. So y is equal to the square root of 65. Didn't like that very good. Oof. So the square root of 65. All right. So tan is opposite, which would be the square root of 65. But be careful. We're in the third quadrant, and remember this would be a negative, and this would also be a negative. So this would be a negative, and so you would end up with two negatives, which would make a positive, which we know tan is positive. All surfers to California. We know tan is positive in the third quadrant, so it would be the square root of 65 over 4, and that would be our final answer. All right, that's pretty good practice. I hope you have a good evening, and I will see you tomorrow. And go Bearcats!